Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. Welcome to this episode, Childhood Emotional Neglect, CEN, and Understanding How to Build Trust and Strengthen Connections, Part 2 with Anya Surnitsky. This is a great episode, and we talk about braving the 7 components of trust that truly help us to brave connection, and this is from Brene Brown's work. Some of the things that we talk about in this episode are just having the permission to try and knowing that even though we may have had wounding in relationships in the past, that new people in our lives aren't necessarily going to be like the old people that we had in our lives. We talk about the marble jar and how we build trust over time by putting marbles in the jar, and the importance of someone showing you that you matter to them. We also talk about vulnerability, and the only way to get what we want is through connection and joy and having intimacy. HSPs often need transitions, and we talk a little bit about this, and we talk about testing in small pieces as well as resting before you have hard conversations. We also talk about being able to check in with yourself. Where in your body are you having reactions and slowing down before you react? And we talk about the relationship between CEN, wounding, neglect, shame triggers, and how to kind of work through it. With braving, what we talk about are boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgement, and generosity. It's really an amazing episode. Let me tell you a little bit about Anya. Anya Surnitsky is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice outside Philadelphia. She helps anxious high achievers and overgivers with big wounded hearts to transform their pain into power and avoidance into action. Anya uses her training in EMDR, ego state therapy, and childhood emotional neglect, as well as her certification in the Daring Way, to aid clients in making peace with the past, embrace the present, and develop confidence for the future. Anya is passionate about educating clients on how trauma and/or neglect affects the developing brain, to understand how unhealed wounds from the past show up in the present and can have a negative impact on their future. Throughout her personal and professional journey, Anya has learned that what people want more than anything is to be seen and heard for who they are at their core. For our listeners, Anya has put together some scripts for hard conversations to help HSPs ask to be heard and dare to be seen in their relationships. You can go to www.couragecompassiontherapy.com/HSP. Just to give you a heads up, I'm working with another therapist who's a highly sensitive therapist, and we're creating some online groups for you that are going to be specialty groups for highly sensitive people. It looks like at this point, the groups are going to last for 3 months. They'll meet weekly for an hour and 20 minutes per group, and we'll meet on an online platform. The group will be limited to 6 people per group, and it'll give people a chance to really build a community and to work through some of the challenges and to implement these changes. So stay tuned for more information. And now, on to the show. Hey, Anya, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. So happy to be back.
I am loving our conversation. So today we're going to be talking about childhood emotional neglect, CEN, and understanding how to build trust and strengthen connections. So how about if I do a little recap of our talk? And I forgot to say in our last episode too, that if you want to hear more about childhood emotional neglect, I think it's episode 20, part 1 and 2. It's with Dr. Erica Martinez. You can look on your podcast player. If you go to unapologeticallysensitive.com, it's kind of nice if you're visual. There's a whole list of all the episodes that are there. So if you are curious to know more about CEN, which is a term that was developed by Dr. Janice Webb, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com. But in the previous episode that Anya and I recorded, we talk about childhood emotional neglect and wounding, shame triggers, how to identify them, how to work through them, how to be vulnerable and create safety in relationships. That when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, even though it seems scary, it really opens up to have more depth and meaning in relationships. Is there anything else you want to mention that we talked about, Anya?
No, I think that summarizes it really well. And it kind of leads us into where we are today in terms of really identifying how to build trust, kind of putting those guardrails on the path so that you kind of have something to hold on to when you're trying to do this.
Right, because we talked about attachment and that need that we have for security, but we also need to have safety. So what I hear an awful lot of my clients talking about is that they don't feel safe and they can't trust relationships. They have that desire for connection, but they've been burned so many times that they really are not so sure. It's kind of this push-pull, like, I kind of want it, but I've been burned so many times. I don't know if it's really worth it. So can we just talk a little bit about trust?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the first thing is kind of giving themselves permission to try, but we can do it really slowly. And because we don't want to assume that new people are going to be like the old people we meet, because that's not fair to the new people, right? But still, we're afraid and we just don't know where to start. Brene Brown talks about the metaphor of the marble jar. And basically, people build trust over time by putting marbles in the jar. This came from one of the teachers of her daughter in school. They did it in their classroom for how the children could earn extra recess or earn prizes when they were good. You know, they put marbles in the jar. When they weren't following instructions, marbles came out. And so we've kind of applied that to trust, because trust isn't a blank check. Trust isn't a given until someone breaks it. It has to be built in small moments over time. And those moments are just small examples of connection, small exchanges where someone shows you you matter to them. Remembering, your favorite, candy bar and bringing it, to the movies with your friend or something. Oh, I know Skittles are your favorite. I got these for you. That little exchange is a marble. And that over time, when the marble jar gets fuller, you've seen this person has shown you who they are. They've shown you that you matter to them, and that, that should over time build that feeling of safety and security within the relationship.
I love that. And then the other thing that happens is once that marble jar fills up, people are human and they do disappoint us and let us down. But then we can look at the metaphoric marble jar and go, this is not how they are typically. This is someone I can count on that shows up for me. And like sometimes things happen. So I love that.
Definitely. And if it's something, a lot of people tend to share, books they're reading and podcasts they're listening to, you can share the vernacular of the marble jar so that if there's a breach of trust, you can say, like when you didn't respond to my text, last week, it was kind of like a marble out of the jar for me. And I understand you're busy and blah, blah, blah. But if that person knows what that means, that's all you have to say. And you don't have to say anything else. They understand what it is. And you go from there. So it's like this secret language to help both of you really stay connected in the relationship and be authentic and honest.
Yep. And there are times when people don't respond to our texts or they don't show up the way that we want them to. And I think from our childhoods, we tell ourselves it's not a big deal. I shouldn't say anything. All of those little injuries, they do build up and add up over time. So if you have relationships where you've got trust established, you can let somebody know that you felt hurt or disappointed, or it felt like they were taking a marble from the jar. And if these are relationships that you've been working on, the safety is there, and this adds depth to the relationship. In a healthy relationship, someone would say, you're right, I'm really sorry. That really must have felt awful, as opposed to, what do you mean? I'm always here. I've been busy. Don't you? That's part of how we evaluate trust too, is if we're vulnerable with someone, how do they respond when we give them a little piece of our heart? Are they going to hold it and honor it? Or are they going to make it about, well, I'm always here for you. And that whole thing.
You have to get defensive. That's not helpful at all. And also, like, another thing to add is when we're just starting out, trying to re-engage in relationships when we have been burned, a lot of times we find what we're looking for. So if you're looking for examples where this person's going to let you down, you may find more of those. When you're looking for examples of marbles, you may find them. And so it's important to have a balance, at least a balanced, perspective, that people do have the capacity. They generally, want to build a connection as well. And they're coming from their own place of wounding and their own backgrounds and things like that. And so vice versa, they might have a marble jar for you. And if you can also show them and fill their marble jar, it might be helpful to come back and be reciprocal.
Right, right. I love that.
And also, I think HSPs probably already do that. Not that I don't want to have the assumption that they don't, but I think that there's also, you want it to be balanced, so you're not giving too many marbles and not getting enough back. And that's where we may have been burned in the past too, where we don't realize we're overextending ourselves.
Right. And I think it's really common for people that have experienced childhood emotional neglect that because people couldn't attend to our needs and feelings, and as highly sensitive people, we're very in tune with other people's feelings. We tend to be givers and doers because we're really good at it. And if you grew up in an environment where your feelings and needs weren't recognized or acknowledged, the way that we can get connection is by serving and doing for others. And then it gives us a sense of connection and esteem. It's not based on other people seeing and honoring who we are. It's based on our doing. And so while it's a gift, I think it's something that we need to be mindful of because we want to have that sense of connection, but ultimately we want it to be in a mutually reciprocal relationship. It doesn't mean that it's always 50-50. Sometimes it's 90-10, sometimes it's 10-90, but as long as over time it balances and we're being seen for who we are, not for what we do to make the other person feel better, because that's how we often get our sense of value and connection.
Totally. And I think that where some people might struggle is believing they deserve to get their needs met. They deserve to be seen, even if they're not doing anything to earn it first.
Right. Our society is a doing society. We have value for everything that we do. How many memes do you see? Great job. You relaxed today. You go for it.
Yeah. Yep. We're very much a, competitive society, but it's also scarcity based. So there's like this never enough. You can never do enough. You can never be enough. And combating that message is super important because we're imperfect and enough.
Yep. And what I would want each and every listener to know is that you matter. You have value. Just because you live and breathe, you are precious. You don't have to do anything to earn anything, that you have value because you exist. I know that's a hard one for some people and that's not how we're wired, but that's the place that I would love everybody to eventually get to.
Absolutely. Me too. And when there's CEN, we tend to have the beliefs that, like, how can that be true? How can I be worthy when I wasn't treated that way? But what you just said, like, that is 100% true. And the messages that we got from CEN, or little T traumas counteracted that. But that's the story about that. That's not the truth.
Right. And the reason why we didn't get it is not because we weren't worthy of it. It's because the people that raised us didn't have it to give. If we can get that that's where the disconnect is, it's not that I'm unlovable and unworthy and I didn't get it. It's that the people around me didn't have it to give it to me and they couldn't see me. And now that I'm an adult, it's time for me to take responsibility and heal the wounding.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. If you need to listen to that over and over until you believe it, please do, because it's so important. It's so important.
Yeah. And you might notice that my guess is that when you hear that, it either resonates or your gremlins come up and tell you something contrary to that.
Yep.
Pay attention to that. And whatever those gremlins are telling you, write that stuff down and look at it and see if you can come up with a statement to challenge that, because that's kind of that old belief system that's trying to keep you hooked in to an old narrative, and you don't have to do that anymore.
Yep. Permission to kind of get rid of that. Get rid of it.
Yep. So you and I had talked about, Brene Brown has an acronym called BRAVING. Can you talk about what that is and why we'd want to use it?
Yeah, so she talks about there are these 7 components of trust that come up in the research that she's done that help us breathe connection, because that's what, when we trust someone, that's what we get. We get a stronger, more authentic connection. That's why we're here on earth. That's what we want. That gives us joy, belonging, love, like everything that we want, but it's also vulnerable. And so that's what we're talking about, is to like, what do we do to put the marbles in the jar? So a marble is a representation of one or more of these 7 things. So the first one is B, boundaries. And that is what is okay with us and what's not okay with us. There are physical boundaries, emotional boundaries. There are boundaries around time. Anything where you can draw a line, there's a boundary. And understanding what you need to feel safe and secure in the relationship with your boundaries, and being able to communicate that with the people that you're in a relationship with.
So what would that look like?
So it was exactly in the last podcast, Patricia, you talked about having an online meeting and the person wasn't there on time. And you circled back with them and just let them know that that was really difficult for you. And it's really helpful. And it's really important for you when people show up on time for you. That's just one of the really important things. And so that's setting a boundary, that this is super important to me. Or a boundary could be a bedtime for a child. A boundary can be, that there's a door closed, like they're literal boundaries. And then figurative boundaries, like when we're talking, like I can't have you yell at me because I'm going to shut down. So please talk to me in a calmer voice. That's a boundary too. That's not okay to yell at me. So boundaries are actually like everywhere. We just don't realize that we can set them, and that it's really helpful, because then other people know what you need as well. They may have no idea that's a boundary for you.
Yep. I want to add something to the boundary that I set with someone about showing up for an online meeting and them not showing up. This is a little bit more information, but I think this helps to understand. I want to swear, I have a shirt ton of abandonment issues. Like that's one of my core wounds. So if I show up and somebody doesn't show up, it triggers that abandonment wound. So not only is it's important for you to show up, but the other part is, if you can't, just communicate with me. Let me know. And then I have lots of room and grace. It's more of that thing of feeling like you dress up and you show up for a party and nobody's there and it stinks. So where it can look like it's about a control issue, it's a way that I create safety for myself around my abandonment issue of, I get that people can't always show up. Let me know. Communicate with me. That creates safety.
Absolutely. And I think that people really appreciate knowing that, because if I know what's important to someone or what lines not to cross, then I can really be mindful of that and respectful of that. And that puts marbles in their jar, and that helps me know what how to meet their needs. And so it's so much easier for people to meet your needs when you specify what they are. And as people pleasers, and when it wasn't okay to show emotion or express needs, like we feel like that's not okay to ask for what we need, but actually it's a huge component of trust, and it's so important, and it's actually so appreciated most times by the other side.
Yep. And it's usually a work in progress. Or I may be in relationship with someone who just chronically cannot show up on time. But if there's room in the relationship to discuss that, so I let somebody know what I need, and then, they're 15 minutes late and they don't call, we talk about it. And if it's someone that I'm building trust with, they're going to say, you're right, you told me this, and this is an area where I really struggle. So then we might have a conversation of, what can you do to remind yourself if you're running late? Can you set a timer on your phone? I have room for you being late, but the being late and not communicating over time, that's just not going to work. So we bring even the shortcomings or people not being able to meet our requests into the relationship so that can be part of the conversation. Because just because I ask somebody for something doesn't necessarily mean that A, they're willing to do it, or it may be hitting an area where they have a hard time showing up in the way that makes me feel secure.
Definitely. And that kind of ties in with the next two, which reliability and accountability.
Okay.
So reliability is that, they show up consistently when you have appointments. So it might be, someone struggles with reliability to therapy appointments, or reliability, just doing what they say they're going to do. Can you rely on them? Like, hey, in 2 weeks, I need you to like pick up the cake for the party. And then 2 weeks come and like, oh, I totally forgot. That was 2 weeks ago. That is a huge, like, that's not reliable.
I'm like deal breaker.
Yes. Yes, totally. So, that's a pretty big marble, but that's also a marble. So if you're going to ask someone to do that, you probably have a lot of marbles in the jar, but I'm just trying to give different examples of the reliability. With accountability, that's super hard because that's saying, you know what, I messed up. You asked me to do that and I dropped the ball and I'm so sorry. Or you're right, I'm late. I'm working on that. Can you help me? Can you understand? Like, taking accountability sometimes is a huge shame trigger for people, but it's also a huge component of trust because then the other person understands that what the breach of trust was and why it like didn't work for them. Why it hurt them. So there's empathy there. If someone gets defensive and doesn't take accountability, we don't know if this is going to happen again. They understand why it's not okay with us. It probably takes a lot of marbles out if someone can't be accountable when they're not holding up their end of the deal.
Yep. That's a deal breaker for me, honestly, because I think that relationships can be made on, if you can just own that you made a mistake, that goes so far with me. And I've been watching a really close friend of mine in this. It's a business relationship that she doesn't have a choice at this point, but there is no accountability. And it's like she feels crazy because she's having to do all this work and things are not getting done. And I can't tell you how many times we've talked about it's just crazy making when someone just can't own their stuff. Just own your stuff. Say you made a mistake. It's not a big deal.
Yep. Yeah. And I know for me, that was a huge growth edge. Like I talked about in the last episode, I think about getting feedback on my performance review. And I, felt so much shame about it that it was hard for me to take accountability for it right away. Like, it's not your job to work through their shame for them. It's their job. But you could also say, as a very sensitive person, you may recognize that. Like, I know it's so hard to, recognize when I made a mistake. And like, I'm disappointed in you not showing up for me. I'm not disappointed in you as a person. You can help them, to see their part in it, but ultimately they do have to take accountability. Even if there's shame there, that's their shame, whether you held them accountable or someone else held them accountable. It's still something that needs to be addressed.
Right. And there's so much power that when we're able to own where we have a hard time showing up, because we all have it. And I think the difference is it's like our sensitivity. Like right now, if you said you're sensitive, I'd be like, yeah, and? But there was a time when I probably would have had a shame spiral about it and felt defensive. And the truth is today, I love my sensitivity. And so it's that difference of, it's mine, I own it, I see it. There are lots of areas where I do have a hard time showing up. But when we're able to recognize, like, I'm not perfect, I make mistakes. Yes, this is an area where I have a hard time showing up. We bring that into the relationship and it just creates so much safety. And I think based on your comments, I'm wondering if when I was reactive when it's like, that's a deal breaker for me. Like, it was not my intention to trigger a shame spiral for anybody. That is certainly not the intention of my podcast. So that's one of my hot spots. And if I triggered someone, I'm really sorry.
Well, and also like that's you being really clear about what your needs are. All of these components go into trust and they overlap so much. And if you have strong reactions, what we're talking about, take that as like, okay, I have a reaction to that. This is really important to me. This is huge. And, where we're going to run into issues in relationships is when those things aren't important to other people.
Right.
Yeah. Should we move on to V?
Yep.
So V is for vault. Which means that you hold what the other person tells you in confidence. So, like you keep the secret. I mean, I don't like the word secret, but you're not blabbing and gossiping all over the place about what someone shared with you. And Brene talks about that it's also important if you're with someone and they're telling you someone else's business that isn't yours to hear, that's a marble out of the jar. Like, that's a breach of trust because that third person didn't tell you that. And so if this person that you're with is doing that for that other person, will she do that to you as well? Like break your vault, not hold things, in confidence for you.
I want to say something here, and I'm kind of struggling. As highly sensitive people, we have this need to process, and it's what I call discernment. And there was a time when I thought of it or was told that I was being gossipy. And I think that there's a difference of me saying to you, Anya, I'm having this thing going on in another relationship, and I want to just process through it because it's triggering something for me. So I'm owning that this is about me. This isn't about, we always use Mary. So if your name is Mary, I'm sorry, Mary. Instead of me coming to you and going, Anya, Mary, blah, 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 and Mary, 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 and Mary this and Mary that, like that to me is not okay. But if I come to you and go, oh my gosh, I just got so triggered by something that, Mary said, and let me tell you what it's bringing up for me. I'm owning it and I'm making it about me. And as highly sensitive people, we process things. We're very discriminating. And I think that we've gotten a bad rap and negative messaging about that's being gossipy. But I think that there's a way that we can do it where we're trying to understand what our trigger is and it's not being gossipy. And I don't mean to complicate this, but I think that this is really salient for those of us that are deep thinkers.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because that's probably a nuance I wouldn't have thought about, but I definitely like to process things through as well. So I think that it would be more gossip if you're talking about it to judge the other person, to put them down, to just be like, oh, I can't believe they did that. And, just to kind of go on and on about it. But when you're talking about the interaction and what was difficult for you and why and what that brought up for you, that's really about you and the other person just triggered that. So It's not about tearing them down. It's not about judging. It's about processing and working through what happened. And I think that's a really important nuance. Absolutely.
And to further complicate it, I am judgmental. I have a lot of judgments that come up and I own it. Like I can't not be that way, but I can see something and I go into judgment, but I can own I'm going into judgment over this. This is what's coming up for me. And so I'm not trying to dispute or try and discredit what you're saying, but I think as highly sensitive people, because we have such a strong sense of what we feel is socially and morally correct and a standard that I don't think that other people experience. I think that we do have expectations, disappointments, and a lot of judgment. But again, there's a difference between me saying, she's wrong as opposed to, I don't like what she's doing and I have a lot of judgment about it because I'm owning the judgment and I'm not making her wrong, but I'm owning that it's my judgment.
Sure. So I think that probably as an HSP, people pick up on so many other things that are going on that other people in the room may not be aware of. So there may be boundary violations going on that you can see. There may be a lot happening. And so you're aware of that and you don't like it, right? Like probably you would be judging a boundary violation, because that's usually what people see. And you recognize that you don't like it. That's not okay. And I think there's judgment to like be in a one up, one down position, and then there's judgment like, in a marble jar way, like, well, is that someone that I want to, do this project with? Is that someone who I want to, meet for coffee because of this? So, we're human, we're social beings and we react and, we're not always perfect. So I don't think that I think it's impossible not to judge, but when it's like a nasty, like just negative, like there's no purpose to it. I think that's where it can get problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think we often use it as a way to try and connect when we don't know how to talk about what's going on with us. If I'm having a hard time with intimacy with you, it's easy to bring in a third person to talk about, but that's really not what I'm talking about. But anyways, what's the next one?
So I is integrity. And Brene defines that as courage over comfort. That means that, it's more comfortable to avoid telling someone they broke a boundary. It's more comfortable to not be accountable. It's more comfortable to just let things go and not address things. So it's courageous to stand up for your values and what is important to you, to say, hey, that was a marble out of the jar for me. We're talking about how that's so vulnerable for all of us, really. And, HSPs and people who grew up with childhood emotional neglect who you got really harmed or just not seen or just awful things when they tried to stand up and say, hey, that hurts me. Hey, that's not okay. So it's even extra vulnerable for somebody who may have gotten the opposite message growing up to stand up and say, and have integrity about, you said you'd pick up eggs on your way home and you didn't. And now, we can't make this cake for tomorrow or something. Even if you'd want to be like, oh, it's okay, I'll just go out and get the eggs. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. That's comfortable. But it's courageous to say, I know you're tired and you probably had a million things on your mind, but it's really difficult. And, is there a way we can help you remember for next time or something like that?
Yeah. And what do you say to people? Because I find we talked about this in part one also, that oftentimes people would rather hold on to the resentment because there's an element of control. I'm in control of the resentment because it's mine. If I tell you I run the risk that you're going to get angry and upset and then I don't have control anymore. And I hear a lot of people that say, I just don't want the conflict. So how would you help somebody work through that? Or how can you help somebody see that a little bit differently?
I think that that's valid and that's totally human nature, and that it's control to an extent and you feel protected and comfortable. But then the casualty then at the back end is that opportunity passes you by. There's no connection. By staying silent, you may have told that person that thing was okay that they did, and then it continues. And so I think that staying silent when something is bothering you over time can lead to like volcanic conflicts, even a greater conflict down the road because there's like a kitchen sink worth of issues that happened. So I think that, building up to that, it's not like you can say, all right, well, I'm just going to go tell everybody every problem I have with them, and that's integrity. That's not necessarily. Can you like write it down? What's the problem? Why does it bother you? If it comes up and you're not ready to say something, can you say it in your head? Can you rehearse it? Prepare for it, because you'll get another opportunity. People are who they are, and they're going to repeat behaviors until you call them on it and say, this doesn't work for me. So you'll get another opportunity. You'll kind of want to build that integrity muscle, because it's like when they're doing a lot of bullying stuff at school. And I think being sticking up for someone who's getting bullied, being called an upstander, I think. But that's really courageous to have integrity and stand up for someone in the face of them being bullied. What if you get bullied too? That is integrity, because to say like, hey, that's not okay. That type of, that's not a way to treat somebody. That's not okay.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking too about my question. I think too that if you start with something small, I know oftentimes in relationships, like, where do you want to eat? I don't know. Where do you want to go? That we get afraid to assert ourselves, or if somebody always wants to go get Mexican and we really like Italian, that we defer. So I think that there are ways that you can test out in small ways. So what if I assert that, like, I really want Italian today? It gives you a chance to see, is the person able to be flexible and honor what you want if you always do Mexican? Or are they going to insist on Mexican? And that may be an indicator of what their capacity is for flexibility in the relationship and to hear things that are more meaningful and more significant. So I guess in reflecting on my question, I think that there are minor ways that you can start testing someone to see if they have the capacity to hear your feelings and honor them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And also like doing it with people that you're not as close with, where the risk doesn't feel as scary. Like a neighbor or a coworker or something, versus like your partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because often in those relationships, there's a history of not asserting yourself. And then all of a sudden you want to change the rules. And that can be a little bit harder if you haven't talked about, hey, I'm really looking at our relationship and I'm noticing that I'm wanting to have a little bit more closeness. So this is what I want to try. So yeah, if you're practicing it, I love that idea of a relationship that's maybe not as charged and is as significant. There's not as much to lose and there's not as much history there.
Yeah. And, these are all practices. These that we practice this. There's sometimes when it's easier, sometimes when it's harder, and we can give ourselves permission to take it slow and be patient with ourselves and Like, we don't have to jump into the deep end when, we don't even know how warm the water is. Like, test the waters, like talk about the dinner place before you talk about baby names or something, I don't know.
Right. And if you're a highly sensitive person, you want to do it when you're well rested and you're not overwhelmed and you're not overstimulated. That for us, it takes so much to manage on a day-to-day basis just to create a lifestyle where we can stay in balance, that you want to be in a place where you're really feeling supported, well rested, balanced before you do these things. Or if someone's like, I have a friend who wants to have a talk with me, and I know it's probably going to be a difficult talk. And I had a weekend where there was just a lot going on. And so I said, listen, I'm not going to be able to do it until next weekend because there's just too much going on. And I knew that I wouldn't have the resiliency to really hear what this person needed to talk to me about. So there are also other ways that we can take care of ourselves so that we can show up and we've got our full reserves.
That is a really great point, because not all of these can be 100% important 100% of the time. So for you, your boundaries about protecting yourself and making sure, your self-care is where it needs to be in order to have integrity in the conversation. You need more boundaries before you can get to a place of integrity. And that's how you also trust yourself, that when you're going to show up as your best self to have a certain type of interaction. And it takes these, components to get to that place.
The other thing that just dropped in too is highly sensitive people. We need more times for transitions. And I loved when I worked at the hospital, sweet SB, I know you don't listen to the podcast, but I wish you did, SB, that she knew that when I walked in the door, I needed to land before she could hit me with stuff. She's like, I know you need to land first. And so, or if we come home from work and our spouses or our partners or our kids hit us with stuff while we still have things gathered in our arms, that we're not ready yet. We need time to transition. So it's okay to set a boundary and say, hey, if you have important things, I need 15 minutes when I get home to put my stuff down, to change my clothes. I need time when I get to work. Let me put my lunch away. Let me get grounded, check my messages. So those are other ways that we can manage the overwhelm so that we can really be present for communicating with people.
That's, excellent. Yeah, excellent point, because you're exerting boundaries in order to, to have integrity. You're saying or the reverse. So by saying what you need, you're having the courage to say, this is what I need to show up for you, but I need you to give me this, in order to do that. So other people also understand that they can get what they want, but they might need to wait 15 minutes, and that's fine with them if you just let them know.
Yep.
So that brings us to our next one, which is non-judgment. And we talked about judgment a little bit earlier. But if you feel judged in a relationship, about, not being like, oh, like, why do you never go clubbing with us? Like, what is wrong with you? Don't you want to be with us? Like, this criticism and judgment where, it's loud, it's crowded. That's really overwhelming and overstimulating to an HSP. That's something I don't like. That's why I said I might be an HSP. I don't like loud. I don't like crowds. Like, Times Square is like, I get like visceral reactions. I can't stand it. So, if someone's judging you about that without saying like, hey, what's up? I noticed that when we make plans to go to these places, like, you don't come, like, what's that about? That's more of a curiosity, a gentleness that's not judgmental, and it gives you the opportunity to say, yeah, those places just don't work for me. It's just very irritating, overstimulating, however you want to say it. But if you constantly feel judged by a person, that was my example, but where it's being put down, you're being criticized, those are obvious marbles that don't go in the jar or that leave the jar. That's like, well, I can't really trust this person. I don't feel safe if they're so critical of me.
So, well, two things. I'd rather poke my eyeballs out than go to a concert or a loud venue. So let's just be really clear about that. Can you give some examples of what would be judgmental and then a way that it would not be judgmental, just so that we really make this clear?
Patricia, why do you never come with us when we make plans to go to New York City? like it's so fun. It's right. Well, I'm on the East Coast, so it's, 2-hour train ride away. Like, that's what we do together. That's what our friend group does. What is wrong with you? Why can't you come? It's a little bit dramatized, but, really critical. No recognition that there could be very valid reasons why. It's very exclusive. Like, you obviously don't belong with us. Like, this feeling of not belonging, that's shame triggering as well. And so the counter to that would be, hey, Patricia, I notice like when we make certain plans, you don't come with us. And it makes me sad because I really love your company. Can you help me understand like what's going on? Do we, please tell me.
It even felt different hearing you say that.
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so inviting. It's like, I care about you and I want to be with you and you're not coming to these things. So like, what's happening? It's a curiosity. I think judgment happens a lot when this is like an illicit way that people ask questions and their judgments. Like, why would you put the plates away like that? Why would you hang your coat up like that? Why do you do it this way? Where it's not a question, it's a criticism, it's a judgment. Like, clearly I don't like the way you're doing that, but I'm not telling you that. Could go up to someone and be like, hey, you know what? I know this sounds like crazy, picky or whatever, but I like the plates organized this way. Or I like, when the coats are all going the same direction in the closet or, something, just tell them the preference. Tell them like, make a request. Could you please, pay attention, hang up your coat in this way? Like, it can be very minimal requests. Like, those are silly little examples, but instead of like asking this attacking rhetorical question, that's not a question.
Right. And what I noticed as you were going over the examples is the judgmental ones make it about the other person. How come you don't, you should? Mm-hmm. It is very blaming and judgy. And what I noticed with the second example is there's curiosity, there's owning it. There was also a statement of like, I feel sad when you don't come. So there's a sense of connection of what you're wanting instead of feeling like, what the F is wrong with you? It's like, I feel sad when you don't come with us. Or I know this sounds kind of crazy, but I feel better when you put the forks in the drawer facing this way. It just makes me feel like I can sleep at night.
Yeah, yeah.
That you're owning that part for you. And then it invites me like, okay, I want you to sleep well at night so I can put the forks in the drawer this way as opposed to, you never do it right. You're always, so I can definitely see the difference between the two of them and inviting that curiosity. Help me understand. I love that.
Yeah, totally. And even just like, yesterday my son came, I always have parent-child examples because I try to be really thoughtful about my parenting. My son came home from school and was hardly talking to me. And instead of saying, you came home from school and you didn't even talk to me. And I really would like you to do that, or I'd really appreciate it. I just said, you came home from school and I feel really sad because I feel like, we haven't gotten a chance to talk. And he stopped what he was doing. He came right over and we started going over the papers he brought home. And I didn't even ask him to do that. I just told him how I felt. And that invited more connection. That probably established some more safety. Mm-hmm. And it might not have been super judgmental if I said it that way, but it probably wouldn't have got me what I actually wanted, which was connection.
And it's naming it. I mean, that's a big thing that I talk about on this podcast is naming the process. Hey, I'm not feeling connected to you. I don't know if you need some time to be alone, if you had a hard day, but I'd love it if you wanted to share with me how your day was when you're ready. It's just naming what was going on, which is totally what you did. What a safe place you're creating for him.
Thanks. I try really hard. I probably overthink it.
We all do. My kids are in college now, and I still will call them like, hey, I just wanted to ask you. I've been really thinking, I'm always thinking about parenting things and going back and talking to them. I'm sure they're like, yeah, Mom, it's already over. Just let it go. But I think it's how we're wired. We care. We're conscientious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also trying to understand what's mine, and not to put too much on him. He's only 6. So. Mm-hmm. Just continuing to be mindful and present about it. And then, so the last part of braving is G. Are you okay if we move on?
Absolutely.
That abruptly. So G is generosity. And that's not oh, here's $20. G, it stands for offering the most generous assumption about someone's intentions. So hey, I know you're doing the best you can. You have a lot going on right now, but I still need you to let me know if you're going to be late. Assuming people are doing the best they can with the tools they have. And so as perfectionists, sometimes we think people aren't doing the best they can because I know I could always do better. So like they could always do better. But on this day, with this weather, in this mood, in this, whatever, this is how I'm showing up today. This is the best I can do. And this has to be enough. And so if somebody isn't showing up for you, you look at the marble jar and be like, so is this, like you had talked about earlier, is this typical of them or is this an aberration? And, do I want to let it go and have it be a silent marble out of the jar? Or do I want to say something? And, or if it's something egregious and they're doing the best they can, but it's still super hurtful and it violates a boundary, then you have a decision to make, about confronting them or saying, hey, I know that, this is how, you may always do things, but it just doesn't work for me. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk about another way. And I can't think of an example right this second, but that also, these things so overlap because it's like, if someone's not doing the best they can, or you assume they're doing the best they can, and it doesn't work for you, it means you have to set a boundary, which is like, this is what I need, or this is okay and not okay. And you have to have integrity to stand up and have that courage to say something versus letting it go. And so this is a really hard one, really, really hard, because it means that we have to accept things we don't like when that just might be how that person is, their quirks, or that's the best they can do. And a lot of times this happens in families because you can't choose your family, you choose your friends. And so if there's a family member who is just constantly, inappropriate or, violating boundaries, it's like, how do you address that when it's like, this is a family member, this might be the best they can do. What does that mean for us?
Yep. I think, too, that it's easy that when we're feeling worn down or tired or we're not getting our needs met, I think it's harder to allow people room for not showing up. That if I'm well rested and taking care of myself and you kind of let me down, I'm feeling more resilient. And I'm able to go like, you show up really well and like, it's just not right now. But what I've personally noticed this last week is a friend of mine it's Laura, that she's been sick. She's had a lot of stuff going on. And so she hasn't really been able to show up in the way that she normally does. And while I trust the relationship, yesterday I was having a hard day. And so I was able to share with her, like, my mind's wanting to go to a place where I want to make up a story about this. And I know that that's not going on. I trust in our relationship, but because my mood state is a little bit off, I'm finding that my mind wants to take me down a place that I know is not true. And I think that happens if we get overwhelmed or overstimulated, or there are more things going on, or our mood is not as balanced as it normally is, that the brain just wants to make up a story to match the mood state.
Totally. And so I think that this doesn't have anything to do with trust or braving, but we keep coming back to naming it and being self-aware and the self-knowledge. And so like, I don't have an acronym. This is totally off the cuff, but like just checking in with yourself, just that slowing down and where is it in your body and breathing and getting in touch before we just react. Those off the cuff reactions bring us out of our authenticity. We may regret things. And so when there's a lot of things to sift and sort through, like my mood is this way, this person's having a hard time, I'm not really sure what's going on, separating everything out to see like just laying it all out in front of you. And before jumping to a conclusion and possibly, injuring a relationship versus like actually building connection through being vulnerable and saying, I want to make up a story. I know it's not true. I know you're going through a hard time. So am I. Like, what do we do about it? Like there isn't always an answer, but if you can just name it, that's the vulnerability that gives the other person the opportunity and the permission to say, I have no idea. Like, oh my gosh, this is a horrible day,
Yep. Anya, can you talk a little bit about, I think vulnerability is viewed as a weakness, and it's not. I think it takes tremendous courage to be willing to be vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that is the number one myth about vulnerability. Brene Brown, this was like her, hallmark research or, huge research. She does qualitative research where she interviews people and she interviewed people about vulnerability. And she talks about having 13,000 pieces of data that show that vulnerability is courage. It's not weakness. So she talks about vulnerability, is figuring out plans, for your children as your wife's dying of cancer, saying I love you first, on a date, things that are just so difficult and brave, but they're vulnerable, and courageous. And so our culture totally supports the idea that vulnerability is a weakness. But like we talked about earlier, vulnerability is the only way to get the things that we want through connection and joy and love, because it's the way to intimacy. So does that answer the question?
Yes, that answers it beautifully. That what I'm hearing you saying is that vulnerability is not a weakness. It takes a tremendous amount of courage. If we're wanting to have depth in our relationships, we want that sense of meaning and connection and joy and intimacy. The only way to it is to be willing to be vulnerable.
Totally. I have an interesting example. It's totally, I'm a football fan, and the Buffalo Bills had 4 Super Bowls in the 90s, and they lost every one. There was a ESPN, they do this documentary called 30 for 30, and they were, they do these interviews, and they interviewed the Buffalo Bills, the people on that team that lost the game. And what happened was the kicker, it came down to the last second, and a go ahead field goal that was going to win the Super Bowl, and he missed it. And what was amazing after that is you would think that he'd be vilified. You would think that he would be so ashamed that he'd never show his face in town again. He came out to, the crowd the next day and stood up at the podium and talked about it in front of people who could boo him and throw stuff at him. And, and he stood up there with courage, integrity, and took responsibility. Yeah, I missed this kick and we didn't win. And I have actually shown that clip in my groups because I can't imagine the courage that took with a national shame moment, you didn't win the Super Bowl and it came down to you, which, we all know it's not true. Other people could have, scored more points earlier in the game and whatever, but it all, everyone's going to blame him. And so to stand up in the face of that was, I think, it's such an amazing example of courage. It gives me chills that he was able to do that. And actually he was beloved. Everyone was supportive to him. It wasn't weakness, it was courage. And they supported him and I think really empathized with him.
Well, I think it's that vulnerability. When you said a football analogy, I'm so not a sports person. I had an inner eye roll, oh, yeah, whatever. I'm just going to, yeah, whatever. Thank you for sharing. And I kept it to myself, though. I think what it's about is that when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, everybody can relate. And it sounds like people really, it pulled forward people's empathy because we all can relate to that. And I was imagining as you were telling the story, this person going into a shame spiral and feeling like they couldn't show their face and how are they going to manage? And it's the way that he took this was to just deal with it straight on. And then it breaks the shame. And I think that when people allow themselves to be vulnerable, it connects with that part of us. It feels vulnerable. You're showing me something that, is kind of, tender. And then it brings out that tender part of me. And I want to show that to you. Or we can do the I'm fine. And we have no connection.
Yeah, exactly. It's so connecting, it's so tender, this feeling of disappointment and collective disappointment and collective joy. There's collective joy in winning and collective disappointment. But in that moment, it was collective empathy. And that's what builds connection. And that's, kind of ties it back to that's what we all want. That's exactly what we want. And vulnerability is the path. As much as it sounds counterintuitive, that is the path.
Well, and I think that we all want that sense of being seen and being heard and being valued. And we get that in relationships. But the only way to do that is to very slowly and mindfully kind of expose our belly. And that's where that depth and meaning comes from. And to kind of circle back, that this whole episode has really been about understanding and how to build trust and strengthen connections when we come from a background of childhood emotional neglect, using the example of the marble jar and then looking at braving, it really gives a template to use to evaluate the relationships that we're beginning. Are these elements there? Are we practicing them? Are the other people practicing them? Where are the marbles in the jar? So you've really laid out a beautiful template for people to follow to see if the relationships they're developing are trustworthy.
Absolutely. And that, like I said in the beginning, it's guardrails. So you have something to hold on to as you're building these relationships. You're not flying blind. It is slow and deliberate and careful. No one's saying you have to go in 100 miles an hour to every relationship, just very carefully, and looking at these elements and thinking about it as a relationship develops.
Right. And Anya was kind enough to provide a link to Brene Brown's Super Soul Sunday, where she talks about braving. We've woven it a little bit more with the highly sensitive person, but if you look at the show notes, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com and click on either one of these, part 1 or part 2 of this episode with Anya, and the link that Anya provided is in there so that you can watch the Super Soul Sunday on this.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. Definitely.
Anya, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up? We're kind of coming to a close, but I want to make sure that you got a chance to share everything that you were feeling was important in a limited amount of time.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the only thing that's coming to me is like just tying it all back together, that we all want to be seen and heard for who we are. And that feels safe and secure. That's the safety and that helps us feel connected. And so we've talked about how we want that, but if we didn't get that growing up, how, looking at establishing that now and healing from that and establishing it now in our relationships, and understanding vulnerability and trust is super important to that, and can be a huge tool, to help you in that journey.
Yep. And I was thinking, if people are saying, well, I keep getting in relationships and I keep getting hurt and I just there aren't people out there that I can connect with, it is possible that the wounding and the healing, you might need the help of a therapist, because we have this pull to try and work through things. But often what happens is we recreate relationships from our past. And so we want something new, but we keep doing it the same way. And if you're not able to figure out how to make that shift, and I don't mean that in a shaming way, it may be helpful to find a therapist that can help you see where some of those blind spots are, because we really do have the ability to learn how to do relationships differently and to have a deep sense of connection and meaning and joy and fulfillment. Even if you haven't had that experience up until now, it's about your history getting in the way of the present and you having what's really kind of the most amazing part of life.
Absolutely. It depends if there's really, more severe trauma and shame. A quote that Brene says, if you don't understand how shame operates in your life, it operates your life. And so sometimes shame is in control for our own protection and we don't even realize it. And there's treatment, in therapy that can really help heal trauma, which may be, underlying what's showing up in relationships. And I think, therapists, obviously we're biased, but, it's a really, really good place to work on that so that you can get the life that you want.
Yep. Anya, tell us about, you have a special offer for the listeners. Tell us where we can find you.
Sure. My website is www.couragecompasstherapy.com. And the offer is /HSP for listeners of this podcast. And what it is, it's just a quick guide to communication in your relationship. So I found that a lot of times people want to show up differently and they don't know what to say. They get tongue tied. I literally do not have the words. And so I've developed these scripts which have a lot of sentence completions so that you can literally apply them to your situations and have them help you in this journey. So it's couragecompasstherapy.com/HSP.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And then in the links, I have all of the places where people can find you, your social media, if they want to learn more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here today. This has just been amazing. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for being here. I really hope you liked this episode. I think that Anya really gave us some very tangible resources to be able to evaluate trust in a relationship, to see if we're doing the things that we can to be putting those marbles in the jar. So I'm really hoping that this is helpful to you. If you find that you are struggling in your relationships, or you seem to be creating the same types of relationships where you can't trust, as we talked about, it might be helpful to get in touch with a therapist. If you're interested in working with me, I work online with people in California. We can jump on an online call for a free consultation to see if we're a good fit. No obligation at all. And if you're hesitant about online work, what I find is most people are reluctant initially, but once they try it, they love it. It's great. You can do it from the comfort of your own home, from your car, from work. You can be in your pajamas. You can do it when the kids are napping. You can go to patriciayounglcsw.com to get more information. We have an amazing Facebook group at Unapologetically Sensitive. Feel free to check us out if you want to build a great community. You can find me on Instagram, Unapologetically Sensitive. And if you're enjoying this show, please share it with others. If you want to go to the show notes at unapologeticallysensitive.com, you can rate and review. There are directions right there. It really helps other people find the podcast. And what I'm hearing is that this is really resonating with a lot of highly sensitive people. And I would love for as many people as possible to find it. And the way to do that is to rate and review and to share it with others. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. You make a difference. You matter. You're special. You have value. You don't have to do anything to earn it. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.